A reality that would overshadow even the most terrifying scenarios you could imagine. A rotting body, an unbearable stench, and a scene so nauseating that even his servants wouldn't want to stand by his side. A king whose fluids seeped from his coffin, licked by dogs, once the most powerful and influential man in England. This is the horrific true story of Henry VIII, one of history's darkest rulers. Today I will bring that horrific truth, hidden in the dusty pages of history, to light. You will discover how a prince who once inspired admiration turned into a monster. But this is not a fairy tale with a happy ending. On the contrary, it is the terrifying face of reality. When Henry Tudor was born on June 28, 1491, no one could have known that this innocent baby would turn into a terrible monster. Was this king, whose name is still spoken with fear centuries later, truly evil, or was he simply misunderstood? When he ascended the throne at the age of 17, he was the darling of all Europe. A Venetian ambassador described him as follows. He had an extraordinary physique and a face like an angel, surpassing all Christian princes in beauty. He was a tall, athletic king with golden hair, captivating in every movement. He spoke 4 languages, wrote poetry, and composed music. But no one could have predicted that this bright young man would end up in such a state years later, that the stench of his own rotting legs would make the palace staff want to vomit. Everything changed on January 24th, 1536, at that famous jousting tournament in Greenwich. Henry, aged 44, was still trying to maintain his old athletic form. That day's horrific accident would change his life forever. He fell from his massive warhorse. The 300-pound mass of metal and flesh crashed into the frozen ground. Henry remained unconscious for 2 hours. The King of England was deprived of his throne for a full 2 hours. When he awoke, he was experiencing what modern neuroscientists would call traumatic brain injury. But the real disaster came later when an old wound in his leg burst open. On that day, in the dark environment of 1536, antibiotics did not exist, and open wounds were like a death sentence. Henry had developed wounds on his legs that deepened over time and grew increasingly worse. Horrible infected wounds that had to be drained every day, sometimes twice a day. And the smell, it was so intense that anyone approaching the palace could smell the stench of his rotting body before even stepping through the door. According to the secret notes of the royal physician, Dr. Thomas Wendy, Henry was trying to hide this horrific condition. He tied lead weights to his legs to compress the wounds, but this only impeded blood circulation and caused the infection to spread further. And the most terrifying part, Henry was trying to hide this disgusting smell. He tried to mask this fragrant hell by mixing expensive perfumes, rose oil, and amber. But the servants, fearing royal wrath on one hand and disgust on the other, moved around the king. If you think it couldn't get any worse, just wait. The real horror is about to begin. Let's watch the silent collapse of a king. The infection began to spread not only through his legs, but throughout his entire body. Poisons released from the decaying tissues entered his bloodstream, reaching his brain, liver, and heart. This was a bone infection known in modern medicine as chronic osteomyelitis, which filled the body with toxic bacteria. His weight gain became almost legendary. His waist, which had been 89 centimeters in his youth, expanded to 142 centimeters. His weight exceeded 200 kilograms. This was equivalent to a waist measurement almost as wide as a refrigerator. The palace doors had to be widened. In other words, Henry's size was truly pushing physical limits. So much so that specially designed pulleys were used to move him. Servants would form a cloth barrier around him as they carried him between rooms, cleaning up the pieces of flesh falling from his decaying body. But what was truly frightening was not only the physical decline, but also the mental decline. Brain damage and infection changed Henry's personality. Paranoia engulfed his entire kingdom. He kept springs beside his bed and daggers under his pillow. Armed guards stood watch at his bedside throughout the night. He believed even his own children were plotting against him. His food was never tested by just one taster. Multiple tasters were employed, and every step was monitored. Water, salt, spices, everything had to be tested separately. And the most terrifying thing, He began talking to people he couldn't see. He argued with his dead father, Henry VII, and shouted at the ghost of his mother, Anne Boleyn. A French ambassador recounted that one day Henry shouted at an empty chair, "Do you dare show your face at my table, witch? I took your head once, I'll take it again." There you have it, the mental collapse of a legendary ruler. By January 1547, Henry was no longer recognizable as a human being. Gangrene had set in on his legs and the stench of rotting flesh wafted from the palace. Even pounds of perfume were useless. On January 27th, he suffered a major stroke. The right side of his face drooped and his speech became incomprehensible. Yet even as he lay dying, he signed one last death warrant. His final victim was the Duke of Norfolk, who had served him for years. Archbishop Cranmer wrote that Henry's final hours were so horrific that 6 men had to hold him down. His massive body shook so violently that the bed frame cracked. On the morning of January 28, 1547, at 2:07 a.m., Henry died screaming. But it was not a peaceful death. It was pure torture. But the horror didn't end with death. Henry's body began to decompose at an alarming rate. As the bacteria in his body produced gases, it swelled. The smell became unbearably foul. During the funeral procession to Windsor Castle, something incredible happened. The gases from the decomposing body created so much pressure that the coffin literally exploded. Royal remains splattered onto the hearse. The final indignity occurred at the Caen monastery. Throughout the night, dogs licked the fluids seeping from the coffin. The king who ruled by divine right ultimately became food for street animals. This is the real Henry VIII, the story of a man who transformed from a golden-haired prince into a rotting monster. A cautionary tale showing that even absolute power cannot change the laws of nature. If this shocking history has affected you, you'll be even more surprised in my next video, where I reveal the real cause of Anne Boleyn's death.